Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA for the week ending September 2nd, 2016, the Oxford edition. In this episode, Jay Rosen and I take a look at the week's comings and goings in FCPA compliance and ethics. We take a look at the Astra Zenca FCPA settlement with the the Securities and Exchange Commission. We review the ouster of Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff via impeachment. We take a look at the new anti-corruption law passed by Mexico to fight bribery and corruption in that country. We take a look at a fabulous new resource from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project called their Investigation Dashboard Search, which provides a new level of public source information for those interested in taking a look at who you're doing business with, which ties into our last topic, which is the new, new focus, I should say, of money laundering for non-financial institution companies and how that can affect your business. I also review week 2 of my 2-week, 10-part review of a 10 Hallmarks of an Effective Compliance Program, Hallmarks 6 through 10. Jay gives us a preview of his weekend report. The episode comes in just around 30 minutes. I hope you enjoy it. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, the Oxford edition. So I am coming to you from Oxford, England, where I'm concluding a 2-week study program on the tutors in film and print. My co-host and cohort, Jay Rosen, Mr. Translations himself, is back in It Never Rains in sunny Southern California. So Jay, welcome.
Thank you. It's the first week of school here. So we're starting a little bit late, but we're getting into the fall swing of things. And I considered wearing an Oxford shirt in honor of you being in Oxford, but since we're audio only, you know that I'm wearing some Patriots garb because it's the final preseason game tonight, and it's the last we'll see of Tom Brady for the next month. So I'm chomping at the bit to watch a little TV later tonight.
And the debut of Jimmy Garoppolo. So good luck to Jimmy. Hopefully you'll go 3-1, not 1-3. But really, who cares? You're 4-out. So looking forward to my main man Brady's return, as I'm sure you are as well. Pro football season just around the corner. We'll have more on that. College football as well.
Tom?
But we've had a pretty good week in the FCPA world, Jay. So what were some of the things that caught your attention this week?
Well, we have another drug settlement that we're going to talk about with Astra Zenca. So it'll be interesting for us to look at one of the key industries that keeps on giving here in an FCPA perspective. A little bit of a governmental change in Brazil that we'll talk about. And later on, we'll take a look at some changes in FCPA or anti-bribery laws in Mexico, San Diego, and then what everyone's been waiting for, we'll have you unveil what point 10 in your 10 hallmarks of ethics and compliance programs, which will debut tomorrow morning or later on tonight on the internet.
All right. So, well, why don't we turn to AstraZeneca, because that was the big news in the FCPA world this week. We had a settlement with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We had, I think, really almost 10 years of investigation by the Department of Justice on this, and no DOJ resolution at this point. So all we have to go on is the SEC cease and desist order. But Jay, from the CCO/compliance practitioner perspective, I thought we had some really interesting points. As a SEC matter, we had a civil settlement with a fine and penalty, I think of about $5.5 million, And we had some fairly detailed information that's going to be very useful for the compliance practitioner. And the SEC showed once again that it's not the Southeastern Conference. We need to clarify that. That's the Securities and Exchange Commission. The Securities and Exchange Commission order details some of the actions taken by AstraZeneca in their remediation during the pendency of this investigation. We should note, Jay, that there was not self-disclosure, so the disclosure came through some other mechanism, undisclosed in the SEC order, but we had what were deemed significant increases in both resources and human capital, and that translates to me in corporate speak for more money and more people. Interestingly, they had a centralized compliance program. Typically, or not, I shouldn't say typically, Jay, we often see a more decentralized model, particularly when you've had difficulties out in the regions, but here we had a centralization. Revamped internal controls, so once again emphasizing the need for internal controls, and ongoing audits specifically mentioned. So AstraZeneca was given kudos for its cooperation during the investigation. Obviously, kudos for their post disclosure or post investigation remediation efforts. And I'm not quite sure where it might be on the Department of Justice front, but I think some pretty significant takeaways for the compliance practitioner on what to do if you get caught up in an FCPA investigation. How about from Mr. Translation's end?
Well, the one thing, and I'm not sure if you just covered this or not, I had to go on mute while garbage truck went by. It appears that these infractions occurred between 2006 and 2010, and I believe there's a 5-year period on which charges can be brought, and the company waived that. Did you touch upon that piece yet or not?
No, and it's really, I would have to say, meaningless. And I would say it's meaningless for this reason, Jay. The statute of limitations begins to run when the incident is either self-disclosed or made aware. So you're absolutely correct. There's a 5-year statute of limitations on FCPA investigations. But if the investigation started in 2010, 2011, you name the year, you go back 5 years from there. So if this started in 2012, you'd go back to 2007. And so that's sort of point one. And you correctly note the company waived that 5-year statute. That's not a mandatory waiver on behalf of the government or the government demanding it. A company can stand on its rights. So whatever reasons the company had, that they certainly were well considered between they and their counsel. So the statute of limitations issue is really just a complete red herring there. The thing I would found interesting was that it's not really clear from the order on the disgorgement what period of time that took place or the profits from that time period. So that could be an interesting issue if I went into that in some length on a podcast with Mark Bone about the 11th Circuit ruling and how it might or might not apply to FCPA cases in the Graham case. So, but all in all, I think you have to give kudos to AstraZeneca, stepping up, doing a good job. Certainly a good result for them at this point. They've been investigated for a long time, and this is the result of it. I would have to say you have to chalk this one up as a W for AstraZeneca at this point.
Yeah, I would say so. One thing I don't know off the top of my head, but I want to try to research it for the weekend read is just I don't know if they've done a stat yet on how many of these pharma companies have gone through the system on this, but once again, one of the key areas of geography here is the PRC, and again we're talking about monies that were earmarked for trips and for attending conferences that never happened. So we know that GSK was definitely the poster child for that, but do you have any thoughts on whether there are more of these that will quickly be resolved, or do you think that there still is a large focus being put on the healthcare industry and specifically within the PRC?
So for your research project, I would suggest you consult Mike Volkoff's blog. He's written on that specific topic a fair amount. And what Volkoff has told us is fully 20% of all FCPA actions since 2012 forward have involved China. I don't have the figures for pharmaceutical companies, but that's certainly a large amount as well. And I think we're going to have a continued focus by the SEC and the DOJ on pharmaceutical companies in China for the reasons that are not only in this case, but really in all of those cases. And this was systemic and endemic throughout the pharmaceutical industry and indeed in the healthcare industry in China. So I would expect to see continued enforcement, but given what Astra Zenca received and the companies that we have seen have enforcement actions announced since the April 2016 announcement of the Department of Justice pilot program, I would see more companies self-disclosing and going forward and extensively remediating and cooperating in hopes to get the type of settlement that AstraZeneca got in this matter.
Yeah, so it'll bear watching, as you said, as we go into Q4 of this year to see if any more of those are resolved.
Okay, you had, I suppose we should really at least touch on this because it's been such a big part of the anti-corruption, anti-bribery discussion over the past several years, and that is the president of Brazil was impeached this week, although I'm not sure her impeachment was for a corruption. I think it was an abuse of power. Nevertheless, she has certainly been, if not implicated, discussed in much of the dialogue around Jabalito, Operation Car Wash, and the corruption in Brazil. And I think we should note, Jay, that she was impeached, a very significant political event in Brazil. And I think we're just going to have to continue to watch Brazil to see where this plays out.
And I guess from what we read, her successor is not well liked either. So it's been a very rough period in Brazil this year, going from what's happened with Car Wash, what's happened with the World Cup, with the Olympics, and then Mr. Lochte and his false incident. So, a lot of things happening there. But,
a lot happening.
It still considers to be a focus and a locus of both FCPA and anti-corruption activity. The next little piece I was going to talk about is Mexico has finally put forward a sweeping new anti-corruption changes, and this is an article that we're going to have in the weekend read from Kim Nemerov and Nicholas Burke over at Ropes and Gray, and they take a look at this new law which creates Mexico's first independent anti-corruption prosecutor. It also sets up a whistleblower protection for individuals and implements methods to enhance cooperation across the federal, state, and municipal enforcement authorities. And, this is probably timely with just the way that Mexico ranks on the world's, CPI index, that there are a lot of companies that are still doing business in Mexico, and it'd be nice if we can consider that there is a level playing field now, and that they actually have kind of come up to standards with the anti-corruption laws that are, that have been passed all around the world in the last few years.
So, any thoughts on? Do you really see this as just kind of the opening of Mexico stepping up and joining the international community in this fight? Do you see this as a response to specific problems, or really just what the perception is that Mexico has a corruption problem?
I think it's 2 and 3. So, we're always talking about you can have a paper program, but unless
Yes.
it's enforced. So now, just like this year, we've had the opportunity to see how people, or not people, but how companies are responding to the FCPA pilot program. It will be interesting to kind of track the changes in Mexico and see, whether they're going to be like the UK Bribery Act and have a paucity of enforcement actions brought over significant time, or if this will be more like the FCPA pilot program and we start to see things immediately getting in the hopper. So those are probably two extremes, but that's, what I would watch for in the coming months to see how serious they are about making this a real law with some teeth and with carrots and sticks.
Well, it's certainly going to bear watching, Jay, and I think many U.S. companies will need to. I think they understand the risk of doing business in Mexico, and I think they I should say, would hope they would have a robust compliance program around their Mexican operations. But now they're going to get pressure on both sides from both the United States and Mexico. And I often tell people that the last place you want to be is in a jail in China, but I may amend that to say the next to last place you want to be is in a jail in Mexico, particularly if you are from north of the border. So lots of incentives there to do business in compliance. Jay, we had an announcement of a just fabulous new resource. It's the only real way I can put it. It is from a group called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and they have an investigation dashboard search that companies can now use. This search is, first of all, it's free. So let me just repeat it. This database is free, but it also provides a just plethora of information that's not generally available. And the focus that this database has that many others don't is that it has local information. So business gazettes from geographic localities, company records, leaks, court cases, other things that are more detailed than simply the standard politically exposed persons, and international databases that are generally available that are generally either no cost or low cost. So we're going to put a link to this database. I've run a few searches. It's really interesting, Jay, what it puts out. Once again, let me say that it's free, and so you should incorporate that into your compliance program going forward. Jay, we had an article, I think, in the LA Times, but it really struck me as something that we need to alert our listeners to, and certainly companies need to start thinking about. There was a large bust of two cars transporting, or rather a bust of two cars transporting a large amount of cash. Not particularly new and unusual, particularly coming out of Mexico. But the thing that made this interesting, Jay, was that the money was going to be laundered through the United States through traditional commercial companies. So most financial institutions, or indeed all financial institutions, are now under a robust set of anti-money laundering controls. And if you move a large amount of cash through the financial system, anything over $5,000, it's going to create a suspicious activity report. And if you do it below 5,000 enough times, that will be picked up. But in regular commercial businesses, this is really not something that's monitored on any sort of basis. And it turned out that the money was going to be used to buy high-end fabrics that would be shipped back to Mexico and then resold, and that's how they were going to launder the money. And Jay, it really got me thinking about what commercial operations, just regular non-financial institutions need to do. I've written about in other cases where this exact scheme was used, and in indeed one case, it was actually teddy bears that were bought in the United States, shipped back to Mexico, and resold in Mexico, and that's how they laundered the money. And, if you can't trust a teddy bear, who can you trust? But it brings up the need that companies need to have very robust, or at least more robust, AML programs. You need to know who you're doing business with. If Jay Rosen, any of his daughters, or indeed Mrs. Translations bought a teddy bear or multiple teddy bears, that would probably be okay. But if any of those above named persons bought $1 million worth of teddy bears, maybe the company should start looking into that, particularly if it's a new customer paying cash that they've never done business with before. And it's really just businesses need to think a little bit more. And if I could maybe tie it in a different way, Jay, to another article that caught my attention, which is apparently now Leonardo DiCaprio's charity has been urged to repay donations which were made to it, where the donations have been linked to the 1MDB Malaysian fund. And it turns out that, as we all know, he starred in The Wolf of Wall Street. It looks like, or I should say, it's alleged that some of the money used to finance that movie came from the 1MDB fund, perhaps even purloined from the fund. And some monies were donated to DiCaprio's charity. And now he's under public pressure to return some of that money, or return the money that was donated to his charity. And it just goes to show, Jay, the need to not only know your customer, but know who you're doing business with, whether that's receipt of a donation, whether that's making a donation, whether it's the sale of $1 million worth of teddy bears, or indeed high-end fabric. The need for people to know who they're doing business with on an international basis is becoming greater and greater. And companies need to have some sort of mechanism to do this. And even if you don't have a full-blown compliance program, you can certainly go to the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project and do some database searches there. So sort of an interesting way to tie all of those together. And it points at what Mike Volkov wrote about yesterday, which was, in many ways, the greatest cost to a company is reputational damage. And certainly with Mr. DiCaprio's charity, he could be in some reputational heat if it turns out that he received a large donation, which was stolen from the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund.
Yeah, one thing I was just looking at when I printed out that article from Business Insider about the caption stuff. There's a graphic there showing the movement of drug sales, and then fabric coming in from China, and clothes being made in the fashion district in LA and going to Mexico. And where they have the U.S. drug sales, they have a big, large cannabis leaf squarely in the state of Colorado. So maybe you want to check my map reading skills, but I thought marijuana sales are legal in Colorado, so I'm not sure what the graphic is trying to say.
Good point.
More of a snarky point, but so anyhow, this week, Tom, is week 2 that you've been going through the 10 hallmarks of an effective ethics and compliance program. You started off with point number 6, incentives and disciplinary measures. Then you went into third-party due diligence and payments, confidential regulation, internal investigation, and this morning was, I can't read, continuous improvement, periodic testing and review. So a lot of this second, the second part of these 5 hallmarks have a lot to do with what you like to call doing compliance. So I was wondering if you want to talk about number 10 and any thoughts on how to wrap up the series, both the blogs and also the podcasts as well.
Sure, and thanks a lot for that very kind introduction. You're absolutely right, Jay. Hallmarks 6 through 10 really speak to the doing of compliance. It does you no good to do 1 through 5, have a paper program in place, and say when the government comes knocking and wave that in their face and say, well, I've got a compliance program, you need to let me off the hook. It just doesn't work that way, nor should it work that way. You should have to do compliance. Tomorrow on Hallmark number 10 is mergers and acquisitions. And here I speak to those two dichotomies, the pre-acquisition due diligence and then the post-acquisition merger and integration. So most compliance practitioners, Jay, were fairly well versed in what was required post-acquisition. You need to put on very focused training for high-risk employees. You need to integrate the now acquired company, your new company, your new business unit, into your compliance program, and you need to perform a full FCPA audit, generally within 12 months for the first two and 18 months for the third. And if anything pops up, you need to self-disclose that to the government. But what, Jay, the FCPA guidance from 2012 really emphasized for all of us was the need to engage in pre-acquisition due diligence. You need to do due diligence from the compliance perspective. You need to perform a risk assessment. You need to interview the key players, the GC, the CCO, the CEO, the CFO, top salesman. Take a look at their third-party program, do an assessment, see where they are. And that assessment would inform your roadmap for your post-acquisition integration going forward. So it's really a two-part, two steps, both pre-acquisition and post-acquisition. All of that comes out tomorrow in both a written blog post and a video podcast where I summarize that as well. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been a great way to bring a review to everyone, kind of going back to my nuts and bolts roots in the FCPA social media space. And I think based on the comments I've received, it's been well received by my listeners and readers, and probably take a look at getting back to some more nuts and bolts topics, perhaps over the holiday season, do the 12 days of compliance, something like that, or 31 days of compliance. I'm not quite sure what I'll do, but it's been a lot of fun and been good for me as well. So thanks a lot.
So I've got a quick procedural question. Who should be that stakeholder on a merger and acquisition? It's going to be the buyer beware. So the acquiring company is going to want to be performing this, due diligence, but who specifically should that fall to? Should it fall to people from the investment bank? Should it fall to in-house counsel? Or, from our perspective, when I used to be at Merrill, one of the products we sold was something called Merrill Data Site, which was a virtual data room, which was a secure platform where you could perform M&A. And from our perspective, it seems like most of the people are focused on getting the deal over the finish line and worried about EBITDA, but they're not worried about, ethics and compliance. So who should own that in the M&A process, and how should that really, how should that go in terms of closing the deal?
That's some really interesting questions, Jay. And I guess first and foremost, the primary owner's got to be the acquiring company. And the reason it has to be the acquiring company is because if a target is engaging in FCPA violations, you as the potential acquirer are not liable. However, if you acquire them and they continue to engage in FCPA violations, it is no longer the target, it is now you. You are the owner and you are engaging in FCPA violations. So the first line of defense is with the acquiring company, but the financing arm of any acquisition is going to be, and rightly should be, concerned about this. So whether that be private equity, whether that be other secondary financial markets, whether that be an IPO on the public stock market or a bank, all of those entities should be concerned about bribery and corruption and FCPA violations, and they should be doing an independent assessment and demanding that companies seeking financing through them perform a risk assessment, present that risk assessment, and whatever the assessed risks are, develop and present a remediation plan. And interestingly, I interviewed our colleague Matt Ellis, a partner at Miller & Chevalier, I guess now a couple of months ago, or maybe 6 weeks ago, and he said that one of the biggest things he does now is make presentations on behalf of his clients and his firm's clients to private equity firms who are looking to invest. And it's along those exact lines. It's presentations of risk assessment, whatever assessed risks pop up, whatever, and presenting remediation plans thereon. So you're absolutely correct. If you not only want to access the money in your corporation, but if you want access to capital markets, whatever those capital markets be, private, public, secondary, primary, you're going to have to do pre-acquisition due diligence and post-acquisition integration planning. So it's a key component for really everyone in the M&A process now, not just the target company and its acquirer.
So I think a good, real life example of that would be the transaction that's occurring between GE and Alstom. And there was, I think, significant concern on the Alstom side, and I think GE went in and really helped do a lot of this remediation ahead of time before moving forward with the acquisition.
So Jay, it's always interesting to hear about what your weekend newsletter's weekend report's gonna have in it. What do you have anything other than what we've talked about for this week in FCPA?
No, I think that the one thing that I'm going to hope to try to do is, look into the resource I suggested with Volkov and see how I can break down those offenses in PRC and break them down into pharma and life science companies. So we've got that, and I think it's just going to be my back to school edition of the weekend read, and luckily I've been doing this long enough so I do not have any line pickup or drop off rage. So it's been a very mellow week, and I've been able to keep that mellowy kind of vibe.
Well, next week, or not next week, but in 2 weeks, I have another webinar coming up with the Red Flag Group in our continuing series on supply chain risk management. In our next installment, we're going to talk about gathering materials from your suppliers to better understand their business practices. So that's my next sort of event, and I'm looking forward to that. And of course, we're both looking forward to SCCE at the end of September. I have to emphasize again, if you have not registered, you need to do so. Hotels, if they're not sold out, or will be quickly. I talked to Roy Snell this week, and they said there are 1,800 registrants this year, I think, which exceeds last year, and it'll be the last month push. So please join us at SCCE if you can do so. So Jay, I'm going to ask you to think about what you think the Patriots are going to do, and maybe we can have the NFL season opener podcast next week.
Yeah, what do we have? It's a replay of the Super Bowl next Thursday?
Is that what we have next? No, we have next week off, and then is it the opening game on Thursday? Is it the replay of the Super Bowl? I think you're right. Yeah, and then the first full weekend is the weekend of the 11th.
Yeah, so we'll have to see how the new Broncos QB holds up, and last year I think the defense was just smothering for Denver, and they had Peyton that was very good pre-snap, but he couldn't execute up to his capabilities. So it'll be interesting to see now, bringing in an untried rookie, to see how that team fares and whether it's going to be on the upside or it's going to slip down and have a bit of a learning curve.
All right, Jay. Well, it's as always, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to continuing the conversation on This Week in FCPA next week.
Thanks, Tom, and safe travels back from jolly old England.
All right.